Welcome back to Keystone Outreach. I'm Kevin Stone, and this is video 2. And we're going to start off this time with a little bit of an esoteric topic, just to sort of keep you interested, I guess. What we're going to address is there are a lot of historical relics, tales and traditions and things that arise from actually from the earliest traditions passed down through Noah and his sons, predicated on prophetic information that they were given by their fathers from before the flood. And among those, one of the most interesting is um, the Zodiac, which we think of as a pagan tradition. We know, for example, that in the Old Testament, um, the Chaldean astrologers are decried for using it to tell people's fortunes, uh, and but the reason is that they corrupted the original purpose, and uh, there is an original purpose. We're told in the Old Testament that the gospel is written everywhere. God's truth is written everywhere, and if it weren't in the books of Moses, that the stones would cry it out, and if not for that, then it's written in the stars. Well, what do we imagine that meant, written in the stars? Well, let's discuss uh, what the zodiac is, because a lot of people don't even understand. I know a lot of people are shocked to find, for example, that the constellations that constitute the zodiac are all actually arrayed around an imaginary circle in the sky called the ecliptic, that represents the apparent rise and fall of the horizon due to our um, the Earth's tilt on its axis. So we're rotating relative to the sun and relative to the orbital plane on this 23-degree tilt, which is what causes the seasons, and all sorts of interesting astronomical phenomena. Um, but um, but that circle is called the ecliptic, and most people don't realize that all of the constellations uh, are arrayed on the ecliptic around that circle, like numbers on a giant astronomical clock. There are 12 constellations that each um, occupy the same angular rotation along that ecliptic. So each one is 1/12 of that circle, um, and uh, so that's 30 degrees for each of those constellations. So it creates uh, like a giant astronomical clock. But of course, for a clock to have any meaning, there has to be movement. We have a hand that goes around our clock, around the 12 numerals of a clock, and the reason that there are 12 hours on each cycle of a clock is directly tied to this. All sorts of things are tied to this ancient construct. This is giant clock in the sky. Um, but we have a phenomenon that's called the precession of the equinoxes, and it's caused by the fact that um, the Earth's axis on this tilt, it's not just sitting there fixed um, through all eternity with the Earth spinning around it. The axis itself is on a slow rotation. It's on a cycle where that axis is slowly shifting each year, and it's an amazingly long time period. It's a 26,000 year cycle. So what this does is, the reason it's called the precession of the equinoxes is that at a fixed point in the course of each year, the apparent rising of the sun is in a slightly different place because of this rotation, so that the rising sun at the vernal equinox every 2,160 years begins to rise under another constellation. It goes through this precession, and so it rises, from starting at one end of a constellation on through and to the other end, and then at 2,160 years, a zodiacal age ends, and the rising of the sun at the equinox is now under the next constellation. But these constellations, you look at them, you look at the arrangement of the stars, and you may say, oh, that's supposed to be a crab, or it's supposed to be a woman holding the scales of justice, or they don't really they don't really draw the pictures that we ascribe to them, and there's a reason for that. They basically these images were projected on them because of where they were in time. So at the vernal equinox, we've got a collection of stars. It's like, okay, what can we say that is? There is a reason that each constellation is given an identity and has a pictogram associated with it, because it tells part of God's prophetic story. It may sound like a reach right now, but stick with me. It's amazing, and it's proven itself. So if we go back to bearing in mind that each of these ages is 2,160 years, if we go back to the very beginning, using the biblical timeline of Adam's fall from grace, at that point in time, the constellation that the vernal equinox sun would be rising under was Cancer. Cancer initially, I should point out, we now make it, we call it a crab. In the earliest cultures, it was actually what we now would call a crayfish or lobster. And the idea was it was a backward scuttler. And the images used, a lot of the ancient languages were very simple languages, and so they would use a simple concept or a word describing a simple thing euphemistically to describe something else. For example, in ancient Hebrew, usury, loaning, the prohibited act of loaning money for gain, there was no word for that. It was actually called the sting of the serpent, or snake bite. That's what the word nashak that's used for usury means. So there was no word for usury. Well, similarly, the lobster or crayfish, any of those related crustaceans that scuttle along backwards, they were considered a symbol of regression or retrogression or backsliding. And so, as such, it was directly associated with the fall from grace, the backsliding. That's incidentally, cancer, the disease, comes from the same concept. It's your own body turning on itself. So the original Cancer was the crayfish, and later it was the side-scuttling crab. But at any rate, immediately following that, so that for 2,160 years, that was the age under which man from Adam forward progressed. One of the other topics that we'll cover in a later video is the way that the books of the Bible were canonized, and the fact that a lot of legitimate scripture, a lot of what was among the sacred writings of the temple at the time of Christ has been omitted from the Bible, and a lot of what's in there, of course, didn't even exist at that time. And so we operate under this false narrative that somehow God oversaw, made sure that the right books ended up in the Bible. And yet, you go around the world to the different Christian faiths, and different faiths have different collections of books in their canon. They don't agree, from Eastern Orthodox to Catholic to Protestant. So there were other books, and among them were the books of Adam and Eve, which go into a lot more explanation about what happened in those early generations of Adam and what led to the corruption or the fall of Adam's generations that necessitated the flood. And specifically what it was that there were other people. There's not, that book doesn't undertake to tell us who those other people were, although early Akkadian and Sumerian mythologies do tell us who those other people were. But there were other people, and Adam's generations were supposed to steer clear of them and didn't, and went down and commingled until finally just Adam and his immediate family were left up in the hills where they were meant to be, and so only they survived. Interestingly, all this occurs during the subsequent age, and I should note, in the precession of the equinoxes, the progression through them is in the exact opposite order as our yearly progression through the zodiac. So if you think you know the zodiac and the order, you'll find that in the precession of the equinoxes, the order is reversed. So in the precession, the next 2,160 year age that carried us through the deluge was Gemini. So there were two separate families of man, and ultimately only Adam only Noah and his sons were allowed to survive. While these are interesting, where it really gets interesting is in the immediate aftermath of the flood. So the first ages after the flood, just coincidentally, we pass to the age of Taurus. Now, if you examine all of the early post-deluge faiths, the sacred animal throughout is you'll see bulls and calves everywhere, whether it's the Minoan bull jumpers, or the Minotaur, or the Sumerian bull of heaven, which was the champion of the gods that came down to challenge Gilgamesh. Throughout Hathor as the preeminent deity during that time period to the Egyptians. So bulls, calves, cows were the preeminent religious imagery, to the extent, for example, that in the Exodus, when Moses was away in the mountain, and the Israelites decided to revert to their pagan Egyptian religion, what did they build? They built a golden calf. So they reverted back to their to the predominant religious symbol of that zodiacal age, which was Taurus. Interestingly, that imagery of the bulls and calves as the predominant religious imagery or metaphor persists all the way down until the birth of Abraham, or the travel of Abraham from his native Ur of the Chaldees, which, by the way, is not the Ur in Sumer. That's Sumerian Ur, and people say, oh well, but the Babylonians were Chaldeans. No, they weren't. The original ones weren't. That was those were sons of Canaan, so they were Hamitic tribes. We know that Noah's family were Semitic, and the Chaldees, Nebuchadnezzar, the later Babylonians, were actually Chaldeans who were Semites from the hills up north of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, who had ultimately gone down, had migrated down into Babylon, which was a very cosmopolitan international city and of mixed races. And so Nebuchadnezzar was the first Chaldean king. So the Babylonians weren't Chaldean until the 600s, 6th century BC with Nebuchadnezzar. But anyway, so at the time that Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, which is in what we call Urartu, which would be modern Armenia, we passed into the next Zodiacal age, and that age was Aries. And what happens with Abraham forward? Suddenly, for the true faith, the religious imagery completely changes again, and it changes to sheep and shepherds. When Abraham was given an alternate sacrifice for Isaac, when he passed that test, and then God provided an alternate sacrifice to Isaac. What was it that was caught in the bush? It was a ram with his horns caught in the bush. From that point forward, and I don't have to tell you, anybody who's read the Old Testament knows that all of the metaphoric usages is of sheep and shepherds. So the entirety of the balance of the Old Testament occurs during the age of Aries. And there we have, the religious imagery changes just like that from bulls and calves to sheep and shepherds. And that would be an interesting coincidence if not for what happens next. Right before the arrival of Christ, we passed into that next, the big hand on that clock moved, and we ended up in the age of Pisces. Now, the interesting thing is, Christ comes along, and you would expect him to use the, he's raised, steeped in the Old Testament teachings. You would expect him also to use the metaphors of sheep and shepherds, and yet they're nowhere to be found. Suddenly, all of Christ's miracles are with fish and fishermen. I will make you fishers of men. His disciples he went and chose were fishermen. When he performs miracles, what were they? Loaves and fishes. The miraculous draught of fishes, where he has the disciples cast the net to the right side of the boat and drop these huge fish. Interestingly enough, also, when he goes back to prove who he is, when they were asking what sign, when the Pharisees were asking him what sign he would give to prove that he was the awaited Messiah, and he said, the only sign I will give is the sign of Jonah. Well, there are two interesting things there. Of course, one is that Jonah is famous for being swallowed by a giant fish, right? And then how long was he in the fish? Well, 3 days and 3 nights he was in the fish, and then the fish belched him up on the shore. He was born again out of the belly of the fish. Christ was in the tomb for three days and 3 nights. So we get two meanings out of that, the sign of Jonah, because it's also the sign of the fish. Remember that the term that got attached to Christ, episkos, is actually includes the Greek word for fish, and that's why we have the fish symbol, for Christ. So there is absolutely no denying whatsoever that with the passage from Aries to Pisces, once again, all of the religious imagery of the true faith in lockstep changes to comport with the new zodiacal age. So what good is it? I guess I guess we could say, well, so because those teachings comport with the changing of the age, that's God's sign to us that's the true faith. I think that's part of it, but I think the other part is so that now, looking at these as prophecy, we can look back and, if one coincidence, or one incidence, I guess, of the religious imagery matching the age happens, it certainly can be a coincidence. Two, it's a stretch, but it's still a coincidence. But when exactly with the change of the third one, it does it again, we've established a pattern. So these three in the age of the ages of the documentation of the testaments, of the sacred writings, they establish the pattern. So we can use the pattern moving forward as prophecy, and then we can weigh that against what we know about the prophecies that we've already been given, and what we're told, for example, in John's revelation at Patmos. So, and it's also worth noting that the fish imagery persists. It doesn't just persist through to the crucifixion of Christ. It carries on, as I said, with the episcos, and even when true Christianity, had to go underground because of persecution from the apostolic churches, and they had to use these metaphoric devices. The metaphors were also related to water and fish. For example, the Grail romances that basically cast Parzival in the role of the Israelite who doesn't know who he is. He's lost the connection with his father, who went away to battle and didn't come back, as happened when Israel was taken captivity by the Assyrians, and they were carried off, and they never went back. And so the children of Israel gradually lost their identity. So in the Grail romances, Parzival, who's the hero of it, he doesn't know who he is, and and yet he's got the characteristics of that royal blood, and so as he's adventuring, he comes across the Grail castle Munsalvaish, which not coincidentally means salvation of the world. And the Christ figure in there, who's got the spear wound in his side and everything, who's the king of the Grail castle, and what Parzival doesn't understand at first is that he's looking for his successor or somebody to carry on here on Earth. But who is he? He's the Fisher King. So once again, we have the fish. So it carries the imagery carries on throughout this present age, and it is this present age. But we are soon to pass into the age of Aquarius, and you've all heard the song. But it actually, whatever year that was, that came out, 67 or whatever, that actually is not the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And the one thing we should point out is that the exact line of demarcation can be fuzzy, because the sun is not a pinpoint. The sun is a disk with a diameter to it as it's rising under those constellations. And also, one constellation, the last star is here, and the next one, the first star is there, and the sun's coming up here. So where does the age start? Does it start just as the sun clears the last star of the previous constellation, or just as it's touching the first star of the next one. And that's actually a pretty big range of years. Not huge. Typically, it's tens of years, but it's not a pinpoint. So we probably have not yet passed into the age of Aquarius. But what's supposed to happen now? What is it we're anticipating? What's supposed to happen next? Prophetically, the thing we're waiting for is the return of the Messiah. And what better way to characterize Christ than the water bearer, the bringer of the water of life? Even to the point that it's an interesting thing that even though he'd been before crucifixion, Christ had been, starved and given only gall, which vinegar, to drink. So he was probably thirsty and dehydrated, hadn't eaten or anything else, and yet when his side was pierced with a spear, what does it say ran out? It says blood and water. Water. Strange thing to run out from somebody having their side pierced, but that's because that's what his sacrifice represented, was the water of life, the liberation for mankind. So what better symbol for Christ than that of the water bearer? So what do we know prophetically is supposed to happen? The next thing that happens is that Christ returns. And so, of course, he's going to return in the age of Aquarius, the water bearer. Now, what's the thing that's supposed to happen after that? The next thing is that we're told that Christ, after his return, there's actually a new heaven and new earth, whatever that means. And so he has his reign over this new Jerusalem. And then what happens, though? Towards the end of it, it says that Satan is loosed for a season. He's turned loose again. So, interestingly, after Aquarius, so we have the age of the return of the water bearer. What's that followed by? Capricorn. Okay. And what is Capricorn? Capricorn starts as a fish and ends as a goat. Starts as the tail of a fish and ends as a goat. So you have an age that begins under the reign of Christ as the fish, but in the second half of that age, what do you get? You get the goat. You get the return. You get the return of Satan. And so what's supposed to happen? He's given his season to work his mischief and to lure people who've passed the first test and who are living with Christ in this new earth and new Jerusalem. He's given his chance to lure people away, and he does. And at the end of it, what are we told happens is there's a war. And so what's our next constellation? The next age after that is Sagittarius, the archer. Is there a better symbol for war than Sagittarius? And so the war follows. You can see how this is following prophecy exactly. And then what do we have following war? Well, we have Satan and his lot cast into the lake of fire, into torment. And as it happens, that next age is Scorpio. And is there, if you're thinking in terms of torment, is there anything worse than scorpions? Well, there probably is, but it's a pretty apt metaphor. And then what's that followed by? That's followed by the second judgment. And what's that age? What's that constellation? It's Libra, scales of judgment. And then what's that followed by? Virgo, the virgin prepared. And throughout the Old Testament, Israel is metaphorically referred to as the bride being prepared for the groom, which is God the Father. You don't have to dig much to find that metaphor. It's sprinkled throughout the Old Testament. So finally, after our long saga, after our fall, after suffering under the influence of Satan multiple times, you have the bride prepared, followed by the symbol kingship, which is the lion, and then that's the end of the story. It's an amazing prophetic tale, and it it's from the prophecies that we're given as to what the timeline is supposed to be. It exactly coincides. The amazing thing to me is, particularly though, the way that the Taurus, Aries, and Pisces so perfectly line up, because you could even say, oh well, some secret order, some cabal contrived to modify the religious imagery to comport with this pagan device. Really, I mean, 2,160 years is a long time. That's a lot of generations, and the entirety of man's existence since the flood. So all of our recorded history only covered, is broken. There are only 3 segments to it. So each of these lasted for a third of mankind's time since the generations of Noah, and you really want to believe that somehow some secret order could maintain that, intentionally maintain that pattern, pull it off, and manage to contrive to have that become, the dominant religious symbol? I think not. So, a lot of the things, it's not, in this case with the Zodiac, the Zodiac is not a pagan device that was that's been kind of force fit back into Christianity, the way that, for example, with the Church of Rome, that they have taken all sorts of pagan devices like Christmas trees and Easter bunnies and things like that, and force fit them into actual Christian religions that they have nothing, Christian holidays that they have nothing to do with. This is a case where God did write his prophecy in the stars, and the reason that the Chaldean astronomers are taken to task in the Old Testament is because they corrupted his truth, not the other way around. And remember, the Chaldees, that's where Abraham came from. He was from a priestly family, so that these were his family, who just, the reason he was separated out was because they were falling away from the true faith, and that's why he had to be separated out to correct and purify the religion. So they just corrupted the good thing that was there, and we've uncorrupted it, I guess. But it's a pretty amazing thing that such a thing can be created. There's some other interesting elements that we'll just throw in here at the end. Celestial mechanics in the ancient mathematics of the earliest civilizations were hexagesmal, which is it was a base 6 times base 10. That's how we end up with things like, and we still, those celestial mechanics that go back to Sumer and Akkad, we still use today for things like circular and spheric measurements. So a circle is what, 360 degrees. Well, what is that? That's the base 6 numeral that would be the equivalent of like 10 in base 6, which is 36, times 10, which is 10 in base 10. So you take the base 10, 10, multiply it by the base 6, what would be like the equivalent of 100, which is 36, you end up with 360, and that's how many degrees are in a circle. Similarly, that when you break it down into seconds and minutes, 60, which is the base 6 number, that would be 10, 10. times the base 10, 10. So 6 times 10 is 60. Not coincidentally, a clock is, two cycles of 6 to create the 12 around the face, but how many seconds? 60 seconds, 60 minutes. So the reason this is significant is that the 2160 of the big clock is a hexagesimal millennium. In other words, it's the base 6 number that would be represented in base 6 as 1000. So that's 6 times 6 times 6. That's it. 6 times 6 times 6. The same way that 1000 in base 10 is 10 times 10 times 10. So 10, 100, 1000. Well, 6 times 6 times 6 is 216. And then to make it hexagesimal, you're multiplying it by 10, and you get 2160. There was another significant period that the ancient Sumerians and Akkadians believed was the period of what they called Nibiru, which is this body that comes through the solar system only every few thousand years. And as it happens, its periodicity that it passes through, sort of like some of these comets that have these incredibly long orbits, its periodicity was 3,600 years. So that's the base 6 100 times the base 10 100. So 36 times 100, 3600. So all this stuff is comports perfectly to hexagesimal celestial mechanics, which is another interesting thing. But and there are other even more esoteric elements we can get into here. But anyway, I don't know about you, but to me, it gives me it's a serious affirmation of faith to know that God can create a plan, can write it in the stars, that immutably, right? Can write it in the stars, give us this pattern, project this pattern over these tens of thousands of years, and have it perfectly hold true, as it has. And certainly, I have no doubt as it will. So that's the precession of the equinoxes. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. And again, we're at, now I'm going to forget the email address. Keystone, God, I forgot the email address. That's horrible. keystoneoutreach@gmail.com. So if you have any questions, shoot them to me. We'll cover some other of these kind of topics. The pyramid at Giza is probably not what you thought it was. That's a pretty shockingly amazing thing as well. But the next couple, we'll get back to strict biblical topics, because I don't want to lose anybody on going too far afield here. But this is one where if you start doubting your faith, there are these huge things out there, like the precession of the equinoxes, that affirm it. God's amazing, and he crafted this. We have a purpose, and He's got a plan, and we're drifting through His humongous plan. But that's it. Until next time, this is Kevin Stone with Keystone Outreach, and we'll see you in the next video.